Mr Hudson.
Thank you, my lady. The first witness this afternoon is Dr. Sarah Cumbers.
Could you repeat after me? I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
the evidence I shall give
the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you for coming along to help us, Dr Cumbers.
Thank you for having me.
Dr. Cumbers, you are the Chief Executive of the Royal Statistical Society, and you have provided to the inquiry a witness statement with the reference number INQ 000612632. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And you have provided that in your capacity as the Chief Executive of the Royal Statistical Society. And I think there's something you want to say on behalf of the Society at the outset of your evidence.
Yes, that's right. Thank you. So the RSS is a professional body for data scientists and statisticians in the UK. We're also a charity, and we work to support the public. We work to support the use of data and statistics in the public interest. So I've held this role at the RSS for just over 2 years. So I joined after the pandemic. And my work involves leading on the engagement with the official statistics system at an organisational level. I'd like to stress that I'm not a statistician, and my input to the inquiry today has been informed by the expertise of a range of RSS members, particularly from our COVID task force and also from our public statistics advisory group. And I'd just like to extend my gratitude to those members for supporting me.
Thank you. You've touched upon the public statistics advisory group. Could you briefly explain that group and how it relates to economic statistics?
Yes, so the Public Statistics Advisory Group has a role in supporting the RSS in developing policy positions and for providing advice on areas of public statistics. So anything that relates to the official statistics system. So that could include economic statistics, but also the broad range of statistics that are produced by the official statistics system.
Thank you. Your evidence today will focus on an outside and perhaps at times critical perspective of the work of the government during the pandemic, and in particular in looking towards the future in how things could be improved. Before we get to that, one backward-looking feature, if I may, and that's this. I think in the witness statement you've provided, there is reference to the fact that the RSS found that pathways for engagement with the government became fewer during the pandemic. And I think there's a concession in there that probably owed to the stress of the situation. Notwithstanding the difficulties and the context, do you think that could have been managed better and should be managed better in the future?
Absolutely, yes. Everybody was under pressure during COVID, but ultimately preparedness for any crisis should involve mechanisms to ensure that expertise is flowing freely into government and those others who are making decisions, and that wasn't the case during COVID.
The inquiry is really quite interested in the practical in this regard. How ought that expertise to flow into government?
So during normal times, the RSS has good mechanisms of interaction with government, and those were in place before the pandemic. And so,
are those formal engagement groups, committees, roundtables?
Yes, those sorts of things, and also the formal consultation mechanisms as well. And we would readily engage through those mechanisms and do today. But my understanding from the RSS members who were involved in that time is that essentially those mechanisms ceased.
And so would your recommendation perhaps not necessarily be that those mechanisms remain in a business as usual forum, but there be some provision for this is how we will adapt within a crisis?
Absolutely, yes.
I'd like to ask you now questions about the collection of economic data. We'll then move on to discuss data sharing across the UK government and outside of it, followed by the analysis of that data and the statistics produced as a result. I wonder if first we could explore further something that's in your written witness statement at paragraphs 5.1.1 to 5.1.3. And a reminder, that's INQ 000612632. This on the subject of widening data, and you write as follows. As we have indicated in paragraph 3, in economics there is a specific challenge in developing near real-time forecasting. Part of the answer to that challenge must involve the identification of new data sources that can help shed light on the key economic questions where timely information is required. We would advocate a process that begins by identifying the economic questions that it would be helpful for the statistical system to be able to provide timely answers to, both in normal times and in times of crisis. And then the first one sentence of the next paragraph, when these questions have been identified, the statistical system should be tasked with identifying the data that is needed in order to answer them. And then over the page, please. You referenced the challenging nature of accessing additional data sets and state efforts in this respect could be linked to the development of a national data library, which could bring with it a greater sense of national data stewardship. What I'd like to do now is summarise a couple of the key concepts from that and then ask you to comment on my summary and elaborate. So can we draw from these paragraphs the following recommendations? Firstly, begin by identifying the questions that might need to be answered in a time of crisis. And secondly, once you have identified the questions, go out and get the data that helps you identify the answers to those questions.
Yes, I would add an additional step, which is to identify the questions, then identify the data that could answer, and then think about where you're going to source that data from. So it's a three-step process.
That's a broad conceptual way of looking at how the data system ought to operate. Do you have a sense of how that is different to how it currently operates?
I would say that what the pandemic, what it shed light on was the fact that the official statistics system was very much, particularly in relation to economic statistics, relying on core economic statistics, and there hadn't been foresight in terms of the sorts of data that might be valuable in a crisis. So that process hadn't happened of considering what might happen, for example, during an economic shock, when the economy is not operating in the usual way that it is, but also then the mechanisms of measurement are challenged as well. And so during COVID, those core economic statistics, there were challenges with the production of those statistics, and essentially a whole new sort of demand for real-time economic statistics that could help decision makers to understand in real time what was happening to the economy.
Could I perhaps split that into a discussion of novel and then core statistics? Beginning with the novel, we know that the ONS and other departments of government collected data from novel sources during the pandemic, for example, Google mobility data, data from Revolut, OpenTable, and the like, to try and assess what was happening in real time. We will hear from Mr. Fitzner of the ONS after your evidence is concluded. But would you agree that that was a positive development and an appropriate response to the emergency?
Yes, absolutely. And the view of RSS members is, although the ONS, like most organisations across the UK and globally, wasn't prepared in the sense that I've described, actually when the pandemic happened, the organisation very quickly pivoted and innovated and stood up new surveys, adapted existing surveys, and also, as you've described, identified new sources of data that could give real-time insight.
And so is the point credit where it's due? but with greater preparedness, it could have been even better than it was.
Yes.
Turning then to core statistics, we know there have been recent developments that I'm sure you'll be aware of at the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, to focus on what they describe as quality over quantity. And I'd like to ask you about any unintended consequences that might arise for pandemic preparedness. And on that note, I'd like for part of the ONS article of the 12th of November of this year to be brought up on screen. It's INQ 000659841. And it reads as follows. The announcements today, that's the 12th of November 25, include reducing commitments in health. The ONS played an important role in supporting the UK's COVID-19 response, and I think this relates to the coronavirus infection survey and similar statistics, and has continued to provide valued insights on health, drawing on the expertise and capabilities we developed during the pandemic. We will continue to produce statistics such as births, deaths, and life expectancy that form part of our core population outputs. However, we will be reducing other health analysis work, engaging stakeholders and other parts of government to identify outputs that others should take forward. It seems as though the ONS effectively stepped up and helped to collect health data when it was needed as part of the effort to respond to the pandemic. Is it your sense that this is a welcome course correction to focus on the quality of their core statistics rather than being spread too thinly? Or do you have concerns that stepping away from health statistics might reduce the UK's preparedness to have health data integrated into the economic response?
The first thing I would say is that the RSS recognises that it's been a challenging time for the official statistics system and ONS in particular. And we very much welcome the recommendations of the Deborah review and the response to that review with the economic statistics recovery plan and also the survey recovery plan. And so RSS members are fully behind the actions that are now being taken in the short term. And I emphasise the short term because we also do have concerns regarding the breadth of the portfolio of statistics that will be produced in future. Because ultimately, I've talked earlier in my evidence about the importance of breadth and thinking about core questions that need to be answered ahead of time. Well, if you've reduced your portfolio, then that reduces your agility and it reduces the likelihood that you're collecting broader data that could be of value. In relation to the particular question on health, my understanding from the contraction of the portfolio is that the ONS have discussed the data collection with the UK HSA, and as it says within the statement here, others will be taking forward that work. So it's less of a concern specifically about health from the RSS and more a concern more generally about the contraction of the portfolio to focus on core statistics when actually the legislation is very clear that the ONS is there to provide a broad portfolio of statistics that meet user needs beyond the needs of government itself.
Do you have a sense of the extent to which that is a criticism, if I can put it that highly, the contraction of breadth? Do you have a sense of the extent to which that criticism is more properly levelled at the ONS or those resourcing the ONS?
I would argue that it's essential that the ONS receives the resource that's required to enable the full breadth of portfolio in future.
I'd like to pick up perhaps a related topic in relation to surveys and administrative data. I wonder if you could begin by highlighting the key differences between the two.
Yes, so essentially surveys involve asking a set of questions of a defined cohort of participants. That could be online or it could be face-to-face, whereas admin data is data that's collected elsewhere in government, so for example, to support the delivery of services. So tax data from HMRC or health data from across the health service are two examples of admin data.
Would this be a fair characterisation that survey data, which I think is primarily what the ONS engages in, is data deliberately collected for the sake of having the data and producing statistics to inform policy or to understand the composition of the economy better? Whereas administrative data is data that is collected as a byproduct of some other useful activity within government. For example, raising taxes.
Yes. Although my understanding is that the ONS, and this was a trend that was accelerating before the pandemic, was working a lot more with admin data. So the balance that you described, that they mainly work with surveys, yes, in terms of generation, but actually the ONS is using a lot of admin data already.
We've picked up a concern of the RSS within the witness statement related to the difficulties or the challenges in control that come with relying more heavily on administrative data as opposed to survey data. Could you firstly explain the difficulties, why you put that health warning on administrative data, and then secondly explain what mitigations can be put in place?
Yeah. So the health warning is there because, as we've discussed, surveys are designed and within the control of the ONS, whereas admin data coming from other departments is not within their control. And the evidence in my witness statement was written at a time when there was uncertainty about the future of the census in 2031 and a drive within the ONS to move towards an admin-based census. And there were concerns expressed, quite significant concerns expressed by RSS members about our readiness for that, particularly in light of the issue of control. The reason that it's an issue is that, as we've described, the admin data is there for a particular purpose, and if that changes, if the service changes, if the data sharing agreement, expires, or there's an issue with that data being shared, then essentially that input could be switched off, which represents a risk.
Grounding that in preparedness to economically respond to a future pandemic, can you help us with practical examples of why that might actually be a live issue?
In terms of practical examples, I think there's an example within Sir Ian Diamond's witness statement of the Department for Work and Pensions no longer sharing universal credit management information with the ONS, and I would assume that was a particular data sharing agreement that was in place during COVID, and that has now expired and hasn't been renewed. I don't know the details of that, but that's one example of the sort of thing that could happen as a result. So the mitigations are around ensuring that data sharing agreements are in place, that there are good relationships between the data users at the ONS and the data providers. So there's good communication, there's advance notice of any changes, so that that can be built in.
We will come on to data sharing a little bit more substantively, but I wonder if we could set aside the issues in the flows of data between different departments of central government. Qualitatively, what is the difficulty with just relying on administrative data, do away with surveys entirely, and rely on data that's produced as part of some other useful function?
So as has been described, the admin data, when it's not collected for a particular purpose, may not answer the question that you need to answer in terms of developing a statistic to support decision making.
Are there issues here about the adaptability of admin data in a time of crisis? For example, with the opinions and lifestyle survey run by the ONS, they could adapt the questions they asked within that survey, adapt the frequency of it being carried out,
Yes.
and therefore they had far more control and adaptability to respond to a crisis.
Yes, so essentially the system is more resilient when you're in control of the data that you're asking for.
On data sharing then, you've discussed a specific example. You touch on it at paragraph 2.1.4 of your witness statement, which will be coming on the screen in just a moment. And it's the sentence that begins second. You say second, that further data sharing between central government and regional and local authorities should be encouraged, particularly where controlled access is required, so that problems can be proactively identified and tackled at a local level. This is a spotlight on local, regional levels, but generally, what do you consider to be the barriers to data sharing, and what can be achieved when data is effectively shared across the whole of government?
So in relation to the barriers to data sharing, I would say that there are three main barriers. I would start with legislative, in the sense that there isn't a single legislation that covers data sharing. It's provided for within, across health differently from the Digital Economy Act, and the views of RSS members are that needs to be holistically reviewed. The powers that the legislation give are also important to consider. So the ONS has given enabling powers to use data for statistical and research purposes, and that differs from operational purposes, so that's also something that needs to be considered. So that's legislative. Then if we look at the technical challenges, interoperability between systems, dealing with legacy systems, the risk of errors through manual processes, and these are significant. And then finally cultural, because I think even if you get the legislation right and you had a system that fully enabled data sharing, that still wouldn't necessarily mean that it would happen. And there were numerous examples within the witness statements that I was pointed to in preparation for today of different government departments and those outside of government indicating that data wasn't flowing freely. And essentially, the RSS made a number of recommendations around data sharing going back as far as, I think it was 2014, our first data manifesto. So many of these challenges were known about before the pandemic. We then updated that manifesto in 2019, and many of the same themes were present within that version. And then we then made representations to the new government when elected last year to indicate that this was a pressing issue. Because this is an issue that sits across government departments, it really needs leadership at the highest level, so from the Prime Minister to indicate that this is a challenge that needs to be embraced, data needs to be seen as a public good, and then the more granular steps put in place to enable that to be sorted out.
On the second challenge you raised, interoperability, we have heard evidence that the Scottish Government, in order to more effectively target some of the business support that it provided to businesses in Scotland, would have liked to be able to analyse the data held by HMRC. It didn't, in fact, request the data, and the evidence we have got the gist of is that it wasn't really worth it. There was nothing they could do with it, even if they did receive it. Does that link in with your interoperability barrier?
I'd probably need to understand more about that specific example to be able to answer that question.
That brings me to the next topic then, economic statistics and analysis. I think there are, I don't know if concerns is putting it too highly, but questions that the RSS raises about for whose benefit economic statistics are produced. Often in your statement you've said that economic statistics are produced for the benefit of government. And a lot of the time, the interests of government overlap with the interests of the public. But I think you say that that's not always the case. How can a system cater to the intentions of providing data that's useful to the public and data that's useful to government?
So I think the first step here is to start with an understanding of user needs, and those users will include users within government but also outside of government. And with that, that granular understanding of user needs can then come a robust process of prioritisation and decision making about which statistics to collect, and that's not a process that's systematically undertaken at the moment. And one of the things that the RSS advocates for is to have, in a sense, a waiting list of statistics that aren't being developed at the moment. So there's transparency over the extent to which needs, both inside and outside of government, are being met.
Secondly, I'd like to ask you about proxy economic indicators. I wonder if we could have paragraph 3.1.2 of your statement on screen. It's INQ 000612632. And it's the sectoral and regional variations, please. You state this: sectoral and regional variations. The UK's economy is not monolithic. Even in a more normal situation, different sectors and regions will experience varied trends that are not immediately reflected in aggregate data. This was even more true during the pandemic, when sectors that relied on in-person contact slowed dramatically, and other sectors were able to carry on to some extent. Proxy economic indicators often provide partial views, leading to potential misinterpretations of broader economic conditions. Can you firstly help us out with what are proxy economic indicators?
So we can go back to the initial part of our conversation this afternoon, where you mentioned the novel data sources that the ONS started to use, and others, for example, Treasury, HMRC started to use. So, for example, retail data, data about energy use, data about transport use. Essentially, this is data that gives you an indication about the performance of the economy, but they don't have the same status as a core statistic. But you will find that the pattern of those indicators, may follow the core statistics, and so you can use them as a more real-time proxy for core.
So they are of some utility during a response to a crisis, in particular a pandemic, but are you cautioning against using them to extrapolate too far into a complete picture?
Cautioning, yes, in the same way that there's caution with any statistic in terms of the degree of uncertainty. What's important is that uncertainty is known, which is why research and experimentation on these proxy indicators is really, really valuable to understand the degree to which they do mirror the data that's collected for core statistics. So
if, in the example of this pandemic, if the ONS had been using the kinds of novel data sources we discussed earlier, habitually, they may have developed a more comprehensive understanding of the limitations and how they might be improved to inform the response to a pandemic.
Yes, and that's something that the ONS continues to work on, as there is an experimental set of indicators.
There is a theme in your witness statement relating to the need for economic statistics to truly reflect the public's experience. And I'd like to pick up on one particular example, and it's in relation to the Consumer Prices Index, CPI, which is the dominant inflation statistic. You explain in your witness statement that that statistic is weighted to give more emphasis to wealthy groups. Can you explain why that is?
So the way that CPI is calculated, it relies on a basket of goods, and essentially, if there will be a greater degree of spend by people who have more disposable income, and so the inflation measure is weighted in that way to take that into account.
And how might that change during times of uncertainty or disrupted usual economic activity?
So the ONS had to do a huge amount of work to maintain the inflation measures during COVID. As I've described with the basket of goods, from our own personal experience, we know that there was a huge disruption in relation to, for example, the degree of spend, spent on household goods. There were items within that basket that disappeared overnight. You could no longer go to the theatre, for example, and the ONS was also unable to send their field force in to collect that information. And so there was a lot of work done to maintain that series during the pandemic.
There's another measure of inflation, I think, that's now available called the Household Costs Indices. The inquiry understands that was in development leading up to the pandemic, but it had to be suspended owing to the nature of the crisis. But it has now been produced. Could you identify the extent to which that helps decision makers understand inflation and its real world impact on people during times of crisis?
It's been a long-standing priority of the RSS to advocate for the development of the household cost indices. I think going back to around 2016 when challenges with the retail prices index were developed. And what the HCIs do is to calculate inflation according to particular characteristics of individuals. So it will look at income deciles, for example. It will look at whether people have a mortgage or not, whether they have a student loan, whether they have children, whether they're retired. And in that way, you can take a far more granular look at the impact of inflation. And in fact, the data that we now have shows that there was quite a significant gap between inflation as estimated by the Consumer Prices Index and by the HCIs for people on low incomes during the cost of living crisis. And that's really important because it means that the impact of inflation at the time was under. We didn't have that data during the cost of living crisis. This was data that the measures were introduced following that crisis. And it's essentially with that information, it enables support to be more targeted. But there's also another aspect here which is important, and this is why it's so important that that people's lived experience is represented in the statistics, which is that if it's not, then people living in the UK, if they can't see themselves in that data, then it has an impact on trust, and it has an impact on the degree to which they trust, what the government is saying, and also their ability to then measure, the impact of actions that the government take. So it's important for a number of different reasons.
On inflation, and specifically how statistics on inflation can inform a response to a pandemic or a crisis, the former Chancellor Rishi Sunak gave evidence to the inquiry over the last 2 days. One of the points he made in relation to his assessment at the time of the impact of the pandemic on vulnerable groups and the extent to which they may need support through the benefit system was that inflation was at a very low rate in 2020, which will have affected the rate at which prices of goods were going up. Is the household costs indices, had it been available, is that perhaps a measure which would have enabled decision makers like him to understand on a more granular basis precisely what was going on and how the composition of inflation statistics might actually be impacting different groups on the ground?
Yes, it would have done.
You have just referenced trust, public trust in statistics, and you make reference in your witness statement to the following. I won't ask for it to be brought up, but you say data and evidence underpinning policy making must be published when decisions are announced, and communication of data must be politically neutral. Can you help us with why it is desirable to publish the underpinning data and evidence for policy making?
It's a fundamental principle of good decision making that you explain the rationale of your decision so that people can understand the factors that have been taken into account, the evidence that you had, the uncertainty, perhaps the options that were considered, so that people can understand the nature of the decision.
Two questions arising. The first is specifically in relation to responding to a pandemic. In your view, is that a more acute reason why publishing data is helpful, or is it just a general point?
It's a general point. I'd say it's even more essential during a pandemic.
And secondly, do you have any kind of insight into whether that's a feasible thing for government to do in each policy decision it makes to publish the underlying data and the evidence?
Yes.
With the caveat that you're, of course, not in government, you're offering an outside perspective.
What I can say is that I'm sure that there are many examples of where that practice is followed. And so that essentially sets the standard and indicates it can be done, and in the RSS's view, should be done across the board.
Putting you on the spot a little bit.
I knew you were going to ask. I can't think of an example, but I can share one afterwards if helpful.
That may well be helpful. By example, are you referring to comparison with another country or specific policies within the UK where the data has been published?
Within the UK, yes.
Thank you. Dr. Cumbers, those are the specific questions I wanted to ask you. Are there any concluding reflections that you have on the use of economic statistics during this pandemic and how they might be improved in the future for preparedness for another pandemic or to respond in the moment to another pandemic?
There's one point that we haven't touched on, which was significance, importance to our members, which links in with the public's understanding of statistics, which is about the communication of statistics. And when thinking about the skills that statisticians and others communicating during the pandemic had in relation to economic statistics, that's an area where there's certainly room for improvement in the future. We would recommend that all statisticians and personnel communicating statistics receive training to make sure that they're able to fully articulate and to explain simply, essentially the translation of complex analysis into policy relevant insights in an accessible way. One thing that's particularly important is the articulation around uncertainty and how trade-offs are made. And again, that's not something that was always done well during the pandemic. And finally, to ensure that the communication is specific to particular audiences. So it needs to vary between decision makers and the public. And that's something that's important to get right for the future. So any pandemic preparedness plan should include a focus on communication.
Can I just probe one matter a little bit more, and that's on communicating uncertainty? We've heard from another witness, Lord King, the former governor of the Bank of England, that doctors and politicians like to be seen to know the answer and therefore find it difficult sometimes to explain uncertainty. On one view, in a time of crisis, uncertainty is problematic for the public. People want a certain answer. Do you have concerns, or does the RSS have concerns about how that might come back to bite a politician or a doctor in the future if uncertainty wasn't communicated at the outset?
Sorry, can you just repeat?
Because the question is, why does communicating uncertainty matter?
Okay. It matters so that there is full transparency around the confidence in the decision that's been made.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My lady, those are my questions.
Thank you very much, Ms Hassan. There are no further questions for you, Dr Campus. Thank you very much indeed. I appreciate, if you're not a statistician yourself, although you're chief executive of the organisation, it can't have been that easy. And it must have taken a lot of work, and your colleagues have obviously been extremely helpful. So thank you to you for taking the trouble to help the inquiry, and thank you to your colleagues who helped you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr Wright.
My lady, the last witness is Grant Fitzner.
So I don't know if it's relevant to statistics. I can never say that word. Well done, Mr Hudson. You managed to do it. I don't know if it's relevant. You're the last witness of these modules.
I am, so I guess I get the final word.
You do.
Would you repeat after me, please?
Yes.
I do solemnly,
I do solemnly,
sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth. Thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Fitzner. You are the Chief Economist and Director of Macroeconomic and Environment Statistics and Analysis. Try saying that again. At the Office for National Statistics, I think.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And you've provided two statements to the inquiry, INQ 000605523 and INQ 000657600. In terms of the pandemic, the inquiry understands that you were responsible for the initial coordination of the Office for National Statistics pandemic response from March 2020. Is that right?
That's right. For essentially the period of, well, the first half of the year going into the summer, I and one or two colleagues played that coordination role. That was then replaced by a larger coordination team. We also had ONS staff working in the Cabinet Office to kind of improve that flow of information between the two organisations.
Thank you. And if in ordinary times the ONS is responsible for collecting, analysing and disseminating statistics about the UK economy in particular, because that's the focus of this module, in the context of the pandemic, was one of its core functions to inform decision makers and the public with data and analytical insight into that data?
Yes, I think that quickly became a major part of our activity. It's not that official statistics, the sort of regular GDP price and other statistics that we were publishing weren't important, but they couldn't answer all the questions that policymakers were coming to us with. So we very quickly realised that we needed to stand up new and I think, to use the term, novel data sources to help answer those questions.
Okay. And we're going to explore how that developed and how easy it was to pivot in that way from functions in ordinary time into functions in the course of an emergency. Just by way of background, I mean, really what you're doing when you have to have the data, so that's the raw material, if you like, and then you analyse that data and interpret it. Is that right? It's providing the interpretation to the raw data, the graph behind the raw data.
I think the logic chain is a little bit more detailed than that. I mean, the first thing is to really be clear about what the question is that you're trying to answer. Otherwise, you may end up collecting data that actually doesn't meet the need. So really understand what people need to know. Identify the relevant data sources. They may be readily available. You may actually have to go out and actively collect them. For example, we did a lot of web scraping during the pandemic to collate from online sources. Then you need to securely ingest those into the organisation, quite often accompanied by a data sharing agreement with the data provider, then analyse and, most importantly, I think in a way, disseminate across government, central government, devolved administrations, etc., so that analysts and policy officials in other departments and organisations can utilise that data. And then alongside that, of course, there was our public-facing activity. We published a lot of data analysis during the course of the pandemic that was effectively new.
Which was about providing the public with as much information as you could.
That's right.
And also may have had a role of reassuring the public about what the actual state of play was in a sort of authoritative sense rather than a data-backed sense.
Yes, although I think it's a bit more than that. Our role is not simply to inform government, it's really to inform the public as well. And of course, there are households, businesses, other organisations and individuals who need to make decisions. And you would hope that they would look to the ONS for some of the information they can use to make well-informed decisions. And so I think that public-facing role is a really important part of what we do at the ONS.
And if people are going to rely on what you're producing to make those sorts of decisions, there's an important component of trust as between you and the public being able to trust what they're seeing in order to make a judgment based upon it.
Yes.
Yeah. And then is there a communication challenge there generally in terms of communicating with the public?
I think there's a number of communication challenges. One is if you're doubling the amount of things that you publish compared with pre-pandemic, how do you make that information digestible, accessible to the average member of the public? I mean, I think one of the challenges we face is we have multiple different audiences. We have, if you like, a member of the public who may not know much about statistics or analysis or data, who just wants to know, say, what's the rate of inflation, or in the case of the pandemic, what's happening with infection rates, for example. But you also have the more specialist users, both in government and beyond, who have a more technical and analytical focus and probably want data that is more granular. Often they just want the data sets that they can do their own analysis with, and we really need to be able to cater to both of those audiences.
All right. In ordinary times, in normal times, in terms of the core economic data that you collect, I'm just going to ask that paragraph from Professor Diamond's statement goes up, which sort of sets this out. It's INQ 00605523. And we see there in the context of the labour market part of his statement, the ONS produces a wide range of monthly labour market statistics. These include employment, unemployment, economic inactivity, earnings, job vacancies and redundancies, drawing on a range of household and business surveys, as well as administrative data. So that's in sort of normal times, steady state, the sort of things that you're doing at the ONS. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And the core surveys, so this is survey data, would typically include, first of all, the labour force survey. Is that right?
Yes, although if we're talking about labour market statistics, we publish and have for some time published a wide range of labour market statistics. So that includes the labour force survey, but also includes survey of job vacancies, of redundancies, workforce jobs, which is an industry survey, average weekly earnings. And from pre-pandemic times, we started publishing monthly HMRC real-time information on payrolls.
Okay. But just breaking them down, the labour force survey, that's a household survey, is this right, on employment, unemployment, hours worked, occupation, industry. So that gives you the ability to produce stats on the labour market?
Yes.
There's also an annual survey of hours and earnings, which is an employer survey, is that right? Looking at earnings and pay distribution.
Yes, it's an employer survey based on a sample drawn from the HMRC payroll data.
Yeah. The annual business survey, which is a survey on businesses looking at turnover, employment, purchases. So that's looking at statistics related to business and industry.
Yes.
Then also the living costs and food survey. So this is focusing really on household spending, is that right? And it informs core statistics on inflation, for example.
And also on GDP. Yes, that's correct.
And then also a survey that looks at wealth and assets. So looking at a household survey, looking at property, pensions, savings, levels of debt. So you can look at the levels of wealth that might not be obvious just from income, wages, but this is wealth, and you can look at inequality through that lens. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah. And in ordinary times, who would you say are the key users of the statistics that you produce about the economy? And I'm just interested to identify them and what they use your statistics for. And can we think, first of all, in terms of government terms, the Treasury? Are they a key recipient?
The Treasury, the Department for Business, other departments to a lesser extent, obviously the Office of Budget Responsibility, but also importantly the Bank of England.
And then outside government, are there non-government stakeholders like the Royal Statistical Society and others?
Yes, although I'd also mention business and particularly financial markets. It's really important in the UK, given the size of financial markets, that we publish accurate and timely economic statistics so that people in the city, for example, can assess what the rate of inflation is, what level of public debt there is, how fast the economy is growing, etc., because that affects market prices. And you can see that when we publish data that perhaps may not be in line with consensus, you can see market rates change. So it's really important that those data are as good as we can make them.
And you can imagine in the pandemic that there would have been increased demands for data. People wanted as much data as they could get their hands on, potentially for different reasons. You know, from a government perspective,
sure,
they're setting economic policy, and then from a business perspective in terms of reacting to the pandemic. I just wonder if those increased demands put you under strain, and if there was any complexity in sort of balancing how you met those needs, as between the needs of government that was demanding certain statistics to make decisions, and the non-government stakeholders.
Well, as I said earlier, there was a big increase in the amount of data, statistics and analysis that we published over the course of the pandemic, particularly in 2020 and 2021. In the first few months, we didn't have any additional staff, although we did start recruiting later in the year. So effectively, we had to make the best use of the people we had when we went into the lockdown, the first lockdown. And that meant taking people off of other work, including field work and those core statistical production teams that were producing economic statistics, and deploying them onto things like the business impact survey, the household survey, the COVID survey, and also bringing in more real-time indicators as well. So there was a significant diversion of effort onto the pandemic response.
Well, that's understandable. And but if you assume a recovery from the pandemic, that diversion, has that had a longer-term cost and consequence?
I think it has. I think the prioritisation statement that we published in November was referenced earlier, and what we effectively say there is that we need to focus more on the quality of our official statistics, and that inevitably means doing less, reducing the quantity and potentially some of the breadth of the statistics that we produce. I think it was really striking post-pandemic when I was looking at what other national statistics were doing is they were stopping and unwinding their pandemic response faster than we did. I think we maintained it for a longer period. And as the quote about health statistics showed, we've been continuing, in fact, we continue to put a significant amount of effort into health statistics over the last 5 years as well. Now, I think during the pandemic, everyone rose above and beyond. People were working very long hours, and we were able to maintain both those core official statistics and the pandemic-related data statistics analysis through basically people working hard and some additional recruitment. That's not sustainable for a 5-year period because, you know, when you take people out of system production teams, when you have unfilled vacancies, then clearly challenges emerge, quality issues emerge, as we have seen over the last couple of years. And I think what the prioritisation statement was really trying to signal is that we are focusing more on those core statistics to get the quality back to where it needs to be.
Yeah. Just want to pick that up, the idea it's not sustainable. Is that a resource problem? Or is it more than just a resource problem? If you had more resources, could you sustain doing all of those things and do them at the level of quality that you would want to do? And linked to that, I mean, you don't want to be doing things for which there is no benefit. You know, so just gathering data and analysing it for no real purpose in ordinary time. And I just wonder how you meet that challenge of being able to stand something up to deal with an emergency without having a lot of slack in the system in ordinary times.
Well, I think generally when you go out and talk to users, they always want more. They want more statistics. They want a wider range of statistics. And I think that one of the key challenges for the ONS in recent years has been to really be clear about what our core mission is and to focus on delivering that to the quality that people expect. You cannot be all things to all people because demand is almost infinite out there. So ultimately you have to make choices, and that involves potentially doing less in some areas. Now, additional resources could mean that we could do more, but ultimately there are limits to budgets, and of course, you know, many parts of government at the moment are facing fairly challenging budget settlements. I think we've been able to maintain a reasonable level of resourcing, but in order to justify that, I think we need to show that we're focusing on our core business.
Would having that narrower focus on your core business affect at all your ability to respond to another emergency?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, we had fewer people at the start of the pandemic than we have now. I think the issue is more about the sustainability. Like I said, you can expect people to kind of work past midnight and then be back on their laptops at 4 a.m. maybe in the middle of a crisis, which I did see during the first lockdown. But you can't maintain that for an extended period, and you just risk burning people out. And I think that's one of the important distinctions between a national emergency and business as usual, that in normal times you want to make sure that you are properly resourcing teams and focusing on delivering the right things. In a pandemic, people are more than willing to go above and beyond to deliver that, but they can't do that forever. But, you know, I think given the constraints that we had at the time, we responded quite fast, and as Sarah Campbell was talking about, introduced a range of novel data sets that I think were very informative, informing both policymakers and the public about both the impacts of the pandemic and the government response.
I suppose the key question really is looking ahead. Do you think you're in the same position if there was another emergency? You'd have to ask people to burn the midnight oil in that way and just to do more. Or do you think you're better prepared generally, and that things have developed so that it's easier to produce that sort of data?
Well, I know you want me to look ahead, but I think it might be worth also looking back at where we were pre-pandemic. Just briefly, if you'll indulge me.
Of course.
So back in 2016, Professor Charles Bean published an independent review of economic statistics, and amongst the recommendations in his review was that we introduce more economic analysis into the organisation, more data science capabilities, make greater use of big data, and indeed bring more big data into the organisation and use it more actively along with more administrative data and establish a data science campus. Now, what that meant is that when the pandemic hit, we had a significant team of data scientists who could, as I said, do the data scraping, bring in a range of novel data sources. We already had a small set of real-time indicators that we've been producing, including shipping data, road traffic data. We had established relationships with 2 financial institutions who are providing high-frequency card spending data. And we also had introduced a few years before that monthly GDP, which meant that we had a more timely take on the state of economic activity than if you're just solely reliant on quarterly GDP estimates. So those things really helped in 2020 during the pandemic to be able to provide not only more timely updates on the state of the economy, but also bring in a whole range of additional data sources. And I think what really struck me in the first lockdown is the number of companies and businesses that were approaching us offering their data. We introduced a kind of a quick process to assess whether that additional data would be valuable and useful for policymakers and the public, and found ways of onboarding that quickly and starting to share that across government. So I think in some ways, the Bean Review laid some of the groundwork for our ability to respond quickly when the pandemic hit. In terms of where we go next, I've read the RSS written evidence and I agree with most of their recommendations. I think that most of them are very sensible. One point I would probably take a different position on is the one that we need to kind of work out what the economic questions will be for the next crisis and make sure that we have the data ready to hand when that hits. I think that's assuming that the next crisis will be the same as the last one. And I think the challenge is every national emergency will probably have different characteristics and there may be different data requirements. And I don't think it's really possible to anticipate what those may be in advance of that. However, we continue to have access to that financial transactions high-frequency data. We have access to scanner data from several major retailers, which we'll be incorporating into our headline inflation numbers from next year. And frankly, it would have been very helpful in 2020 if we had had that information. Government also has access to high-frequency mobility data. So some of those, we found that those were incredibly granular and regular in a way that we use frequently during the pandemic response, and we would probably use again in the event of another pandemic or national crisis. So that would be a good starting point. The fact that we have lots of analysts with the ability to quickly stand up new data sources in response to the questions that we're getting from policymakers means I think we could respond flexibly to the next crisis, whatever form that may take.
And
Just before you go on,
sorry.
could you slow down?
Oh, sorry, yes.
So I know I have a very patient bunch of stenographers, but I'm afraid
Apologies.
they've been tested this week. Sorry to interrupt, Mr.
No, not at all. No, my fault. I should have asked you to slow down. So I think what you're saying essentially is that you need to retain agility, so the ability to respond to whatever the nature of the next crisis is. You can't assume it will be a crisis in which one set of data or another will definitely be needed or useful. So you retain agility. That means you need to retain that sort of analytical function and to have an analytical function that can be deployed in an agile way, depending on the nature of the crisis. Is that right?
That's right. Having data is not enough. You need the capacity to identify, or as Sarah said, source, ingest, analyse, and then disseminate that data. And for that, you need people who are good at data analysis. Fortunately, at the ONS, we have many people with those skills.
Yeah. And I suppose key to that is you need to have access to the data.
Yes.
And you've said access arrangements were good, but have got a bit better since the pandemic?
I think we have, I think not just us, but wider government has access to and more regularly uses a wider range of real-time indicators than pre-pandemic, because I think the benefits of those were really evident to analysts across government.
I just want to move on really to look at four interrelated topics, but first really to look at whether there was a strategy across government on data collection during the pandemic. And then to pick up a discrete point that's arisen in the evidence in this module about whether there can or should be a sort of household data set. That's been mooted as an idea, as if there was a household data set that might assist decision making. Then I'd like to pick up, any practical steps about how you think economic data can be effectively shared across government, and whether there's any further learning there. And then finally, just to pick up a point about data is one thing, but this analytical function, the analytical capability of government on a cross-government basis, and how that might be improved. If we look at the pandemic, you've talked about the increase in demands for data that were placed on you by all sorts of people, but how did you as an organisation make decisions about what data to collect, what new or novel data to collect during the pandemic?
I think it was in large part a response to the questions that we were getting, not just from the Cabinet Office, but from other departments. The sort of questions we were getting were, are people actually socially distancing? What's happening to consumer spending? What's the impact of COVID on trade and supply chains? And a bit further into the pandemic, how many businesses are interested in taking up the furlough scheme, for example? But those examples, there were many more. Now, some of those we could answer with existing data sources, but many we found that the official statistics were essentially collected for a different purpose and couldn't answer those questions, or couldn't answer them in a timely and granular way, which is what policymakers wanted, which is why we set up the business impact of COVID survey. We kind of pivoted an existing household survey that we did every couple of months to a fortnightly and then a weekly survey of households. And of course, we took responsibility for the COVID infection survey, along with the other real-time indicators I referenced earlier. So if you put all of that together alongside our official statistics, we had quite a comprehensive suite of data. Now, but
so can I just before you move on, can I just ask, those requests that were coming in for data, were they coming in a coordinated way, or are they just sort of flying in with different government departments saying, well, I want to know this and I want to know that? And I just wonder, when you talk about limited resource and everyone working very hard, whether that could have been better coordinated.
There was some degree of coordination. There were regular conversations between departments, and certainly the Cabinet Office played an important coordinating role. In some cases it was kind of obvious who would lead. Obviously, the Department for Transport led on transport real-time indicators, for example. We led on financial transactions data because we already had that relationship and those data supplies. There was telecoms data that was used for mobility analysis, which we had access to, but several other departments, I think, also used, sometimes for different purposes. And increasingly over the course of 2020, we shared more of that data with the devolved administrations as well.
Okay. You said
so. I'd say there was a degree of coordination. There was lots of collaboration, lots of conversations. I think usually it was fairly clear who would lead on providing the data analysis on a particular area. But a lot of information was flowing across government and being used for different purposes. So, for example, to inform SAGE meetings, to inform cabinet meetings, to inform ministers, to inform officials. One of the things that I think the Cabinet Office did well was to find secure ways of sharing a lot of that information through things like COVID dashboards, etc., which made that accessible to government analysts or analysts across government. I think that worked well.
So that's really what I'm interested in. You've mentioned the Cabinet Office a couple of times there. First, in that they were very helpful in terms of what sort of data they were after, though other departments were coming in with particular requests. Did you find that sort of coordinating function, particularly as the pandemic developed, things being focused through the Cabinet Office and the COVID task force, made life easier for you in terms of getting one set of requests?
I think it did, because we didn't have to fill multiple requests from multiple sources. Obviously we still spoke to other departments and had bilateral conversations as well, but that coordinating function I think worked quite effectively. Obviously in the early days it was quite a small team. As I said, we seconded some statisticians to the Cabinet Office to help coordinate that, and I think the fact that we had ONS colleagues in the Cabinet Office who could just pick up the phone to me and tell me, we need to find X, and I could talk to the campus or talk to my other analysts and make sure that we got that information. That worked well, and I think it worked at pace. But in the early days, obviously, people were kind of still setting up teams and ways of coordinating. So there, it took a few weeks for that to bed down.
And in a future crisis, whatever the nature of it, do you think it would be beneficial to have that coordinating function from the outset coming from the centre, or do you think it's still important to retain all of those links with all the other departments as well?
I think it would be sensible unless the nature of that national crisis meant that it would be more sensible for another department to coordinate it for. So, for example, if it was a transport-related issue, maybe the Department for Transport might be a better place to coordinate.
But if it was a true national crisis of the type that the pandemic presented, do you think a central coordinating function would be a better way of engaging with the ONS?
I think it's essential, really.
Yeah. And you spoke about the surveys that you developed. I think just to note this, because we're really interested in economic surveys, but there was the coronavirus infection survey, which gave the health picture. Important, though, to inform the economic policy making of government, but it provided the health picture. And then there was also the business impact COVID-19 survey, is that right?
That's right.
And why was that stood up in particular?
Firstly, we needed something that was more regular than the monthly business surveys we were using for monthly GDP. But secondly, there are a whole range of questions that Treasury, the Department for Business and others wanted us to ask business. So, for example, when the coronavirus job retention scheme was being developed, colleagues in other departments were not sure what the level of take-up would be. So we asked business, would you be interested? How likely would you be to be involved in the scheme? And which actually tracked the HMRC data quite closely, and I think that was kind of useful to give people a sense of that. Likewise, the SEISS scheme. So we asked about those. We asked about what businesses were doing in terms of their use of labour, were they standing people down, how many people were taking up furlough, how severely had business operations been impacted, etc. I mean, we asked a range of questions, and we found that it was quite a flexible tool because as the pandemic evolved and the questions changed, we were able to quickly, add new questions onto the survey and go back to departments within a couple of weeks in terms of here's what business think.
And I mean, you may say it's for those who used it to make economic decisions that I should be directing this, but did you have a sense of how valuable economic decision makers were finding the data you were getting from that survey? Were you getting feedback about it?
We did get lots of feedback at the time, usually people wanting more or more granular or more timely, as they always do. But yes, I think we got lots of positive feedback because I think we were ultimately able to answer most of the questions that were coming our way. I mean, we were told that our weekly financial transactions report landed on the desk of the Prime Minister and was amongst his favourite reading. I don't know if that anecdote is true, but that kind of insight, that really timely insight, we just didn't have before the pandemic.
It's always tempting to say, well, that worked well, so let's bake that in as something we definitely do next time. But you've just picked up that actually one of the benefits of this survey was it could be variable. You could target different things. So do you think it's important to sort of bank the learning of how valuable it could be as a survey, but not have too many hard and fast rules about how it would be stood up in a future emergency?
Well, we have continued with that survey, although obviously we changed some of the significant number of the questions.
That's what I'm really getting at.
We have found that it's of continuing use, and certainly other departments as well find it useful to use that as a vehicle to engage with business.
Yeah, but not having prescriptive questions that will never change because you don't know what data is going to be important.
Well, I think with something like a kind of a monthly or fortnightly business survey, you want a combination of questions that you ask every month so you can get a continuous time series of business activity and more topical questions that you kind of rotate through as issues change. So, for example, we had questions around prices and cost of living impacts when inflation picked up in 2022. As other policy issues emerge, we've used that survey to ask about a whole range of other issues.
So in a future emergency, that survey could continue.
That would be available, and we could quickly stand that up and potentially increase the frequency, say, to weekly if we needed to.
I think you also made changes to existing surveys. Is that right?
Well, you may be referring to the Opinion and Lifestyle
I am.
Survey, which is a household survey, which we did have before the pandemic, but we didn't. Its frequency was increased to fortnightly and then weekly. And again, in terms of finding out what households are doing, how they responded to the pandemic, that was very useful. And that also started to pick up on other emerging trends during the pandemic, or rather after lockdown, about working from home, for example. So again, we have continued that survey, although not at the frequency that we had during the pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. And then you've mentioned new data sources. You were getting access to lots of new data sources that gave you much more sort of real-time information. Is that right?
Yes, we had many organisations offering their data to us. We clearly couldn't take all of it on board, some because it kind of duplicated data we already had access to, others because we didn't consider it would add significantly to our ability to answer those questions. But we did take on a series of other data sources in addition to the data that we collected ourselves or had already were already producing.
Okay, thank you. Lady, I think that's break time.
So I hope you are warned, I suppose, that we take regular breaks, and I shall return at 2:45.
Right.
That's right.
Thank you, my lady. Can I just pick up the labour force survey? Mm-hmm. I think that there were some difficulties with the survey in the crisis. Is that right? Because it depended on face-to-face interview.
Yes, the labour force survey has 5 waves, and the first wave, certainly pre-pandemic, was typically conducted face-to-face. Often people, our field workers, sitting in somebody's living room and going through a set of questions using a laptop. And we found that worked better than kind of a written paper to complete because, experienced field workers are able to kind of move through the questions and also answer any questions from respondents. Now, that clearly wasn't possible during the first lockdown, so we had to explore other ways of collecting that data. So it did impact for a couple of months in terms of response rates and the quality of that labour force data, absolutely. And
we heard from Governor Bailey of the Bank of England that, having this sort of real-time information about the labour market can be quite important in terms of setting monetary policy. For example, when the job retention scheme was going to end, there was an assumption about likely unemployment, and that might have been relevant to a decision about interest rates. So, it's pretty important to have that information. I think, is this right that there is some work going on in terms of, for the future, the transformed labour force survey? Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, so that's trying to future-proof things so that you can get that data in crisis.
It's moving to a digital-first approach, which means that people can complete the survey on their mobile phone or tablet or laptop. And also, it's a reduced set of questions. We've tried to strip it down to a core, so it doesn't take 50 minutes to complete, in the hope that that would obviously improve response rates because the respondent burden is significantly less.
Can I just pick up the labour force survey in the context of long COVID and whether that would have been a useful mechanism of trying to capture evidence about long COVID?
It could have. We did collect long COVID data through a range of surveys at the time. I'm not sure if the LFS was necessarily the most appropriate vehicle to ask that, although we do ask some questions on the labour force survey about health, but in the context of economic incapacity. So when people say that they're not working and not actively looking for work, we ask them to give reasons, and ill health is one of the reasons that people have given. So that
Sorry, does ill health get drilled down any further into what sort of ill health? Or?
I think generally no, but there may have been instances in the past that I'm not aware of where we have asked follow-up questions. But we did publish data analysis on long COVID in 2021, 2022. And, there have been a number of pieces of analysis published on the ONS website around it.
I mean, on this point about inactivity, it was, again, some of the evidence that the Governor gave. At the conclusion of his evidence, he pointed to the recovery of the economy after COVID, but picked up this trend of inactivity in the labour market and expressed his own concern about that, and also that it was very difficult to understand necessarily what that inactivity was or could be attributed to. And has the ONS been looking at that and trying to drill down into that sort of pool of people who are inactive in the labour market?
We did publish more detailed analysis which suggests that it was one of the factors contributing to the rise in economic inactivity, yes. But not the only
one. What was one of them? Long COVID?
Long COVID.
Yeah, okay. You mentioned earlier the health data that you were collecting, and you carried on collecting that for a long time post-pandemic.
Yes.
And that's now been wound back, is that right?
Well, I think what the prioritisation statement said is we are looking to wind down that area of activity over time. Now, one of the constraints is that for some of that work, we have multi-year contracts with people to kind of conduct those surveys.
Okay.
So it may take some time.
But can I just ask from an economic perspective, that having a picture of health data could inform, couldn't it, economic decision-making and policy? And I just wonder whether that would leave economic decision-makers without a potentially valuable source of information in a future crisis.
Well, I think if the ONS were the only ones collecting and producing data statistics analysis, that would be the case. But of course, the UK Health Security Agency, NHS, Department of Health and Social Care, and other agencies do publish a lot of statistics and analysis on health. I think this is an area where, apart from the kind of things like births, deaths and marriages, and the weekly deaths, which actually proved to be quite important during the pandemic, this is not an area where we have unique expertise. So I don't think it's the case that if we reduce our activity in this area that there would be significant data gaps.
No, and this really, that's really why I asked the question, because it goes to this point about whether across government that there is a strategy for having the right sort of data. As you say, lots of different people can be collecting that data. Yeah. So you might not be doing it yourselves, but it's still being done. But I just wonder how is all that then linked up and put back together to inform crisis planning and
under the aegis of the Government Statistical Service, there are, I guess, working groups across various themes, including health, where all those who produce statistics and analysis in a particular field will sit down and kind of map what each of them are doing, look to identify any potential major data gaps and achieve a degree of coordination of effort across those agencies and departments. And I know that how it happens in health, it happens in other areas as well. And quite often that will typically involve devolved administrations as well. Now, that doesn't mean there are no gaps in health, but certainly those conversations are happening. And I think if there are significant gaps, that would be on people's radar.
Okay. New data sources, I mean, we could list them. There were many, many new data sources that you were able to access. Financial transactions, mobile telephone network data that might show movement of people, pret-a-manger transactions, Google data. So these are all new. But I mean, the real question is whether, I mean, that's great. Lots of people offering you data and access to it, and you can access it. My question is about coordination of that. Particularly if you're under resource pressure. Was there any sense of a central coordinating function, or is it left to you to make a decision about what you think will or will not help in any particular emergency? Should there be any coordinating function?
Well, as I mentioned, a lot of that information was pulled together by the Cabinet Office on a COVID data dashboard. There was also an API which enabled that data to be downloaded by government analysts. I think it matters less who collects that data, provided it's disseminated effectively and securely across government, and that did happen. With the Department for Transport example, it wouldn't have made sense for the ONS to lead on that. Likewise, on business, there may be some elements where the Department for Business is better placed, for example, or indeed now the Department for Energy, Security and Net Zero to collect energy-related data and then share that and make that widely available. So I think that coordination did happen. We were providing daily and weekly feeds into the Cabinet Office. We were sharing that with other departments. And I think that was widely used across government to actually not just to inform, if you like, the national pandemic response, but also ask other questions. And I think one of the elements of some of those data sources, which is perhaps people may have underestimated, is the incredible granularity of that data. To give you an example, when Eat Out to Help Out was introduced, well, when 9 o'clock curfews were introduced on restaurants, we could tell when people were leaving restaurants and going to their 7-Elevens down the road to buy alcohol. You could see it in the spending data. We could kind of map that across different parts of the UK. When there were regional lockdowns, we could see whether people were travelling outside of that area to do their shopping. We had incredibly granular data, and we were able to answer many questions using that.
Right, okay. Can I move on to another topic that I flagged up, the idea of a household data set? And I'll just, this really originated in an expert report that Gemma Tetlow produced for the inquiry. I'll ask if we put up INQ 000588 paragraph 272, there we are. The absence of a UK household data set based on administrative data also significantly limits the UK's ability to support incomes through fiscal transfers, to understand who's in most need of those transfers in the event of emergency. Sets out extensive individual level data from the tax system, tax, national insurance, and household level data for some households in the benefits system. Does not have comprehensive household level information. The government should explore the feasibility and cost of developing that data set. And that's really what I want to ask you about. I mean, it sounds like a great idea to have a household data set, data on every household in the United Kingdom, so you can target money exactly where it needs to be. But cost, feasibility, where does that sit with you?
Well, I think reading the full paragraph, my impression is this is really more around household income than household expenditure. We publish a wide range of household data covering income, expenditure and wealth. Not all of it, you mentioned earlier the Living Cost of Food Survey, is as timely as potentially you might want in a national crisis. So I can see the case for potentially bringing together administrative data, but we already have access to and publish the HMRC payroll employee data on a monthly basis. For example, DWP obviously have extensive benefit data. I think while there may be some benefits of bringing that data set together, I think she may be overselling the potential benefits during a national crisis versus some of the other data that we already have access to. But I think it's fair to point out that when we published the Economic Statistics Plan in June, we did set out our ambition to make further progress on household financial statistics. And in the update we published earlier this month, we said that we would engaging with users in a wide range of forums and publishing a plan in the spring of next year, which really sets out what we plan to do in this area. So work is underway on that.
I want to move on to sort of data sharing across government. Dr. Loynig gave evidence to the inquiry, and the way he put it in his statement, in fairly stark terms, which is to say His Majesty's government is appalling at sharing data across departments, that the data architecture is atrocious, specialist skills are underrated and underpaid. The government's been, and he went on, the government's been let down repeatedly by the ONS, which was supposed to be leading in this area. It's failed to deliver in the way it was expected to. there's a culture across government of not sharing information with other government departments. I mean, there's a lot to unpack there. Let's not. I'm quite happy, given he's made the criticism, for you to defend the ONS, but I am very much interested in your view about the wider point, which is that government's really bad at sharing data. How does that sit with you as a proposition?
I think there has been significant progress, but it's fair to say there are still challenges. And I think if you look at what happened during the pandemic, the apparently insuperable obstacles to sharing data that had occurred prior to the first lockdown, in many cases, were no longer evident during the pandemic. And that's, of course, because we're in a national emergency and people found ways to share data in the way that perhaps in the past they hadn't always been incentivised to do. I think data sharing in terms of where we are now is better than it is pre-pandemic, but there are still challenges. One of them is a lot of agencies collect administrative data for administrative purposes. And so the use for statistics or to inform policy and to share with other departments is not necessarily their top priority. Also, they are understandably concerned about potential data leaks. And so one element of how we've engaged with the departments is to really demonstrate that we can securely hold data from other departments and we can be trusted to not only ingest that data, but to share it with other users across government. Now, that has been challenging, but we have made quite a bit of progress on data linking. You talked earlier about long COVID and economic activity in the connection with health. So we have been working with other departments on building a linked data set that can help to answer that question, for example, and we're working on other linked data sets with other government departments to do that. Now, not all of that may be kind of widely known in the public, but certainly that was not the case 5 years ago. And I think the fact that the value of data sharing and data linking were self-evident during the pandemic, and also that we actually have a lot more data scientists and analysts across government who are used to using large, complex linked data sets, means that also our capacity to do that kind of work has improved, and that's also led to a greater appetite, I think, for accessing data sets.
I mean, who would have the convening power to make this happen in government? If it hasn't been happening, how does it happen? Does it need the centre, the Cabinet Office, to say this has got to happen?
Well, of course, the government set out its ambition last year to establish a national data library, and I think that would be a natural kind of coordinating vehicle when that is up and running.
Yeah. And Dr. Loyinger was critical of the ONS, and I want to give you an opportunity to set out your position. But I mean, what ability does the ONS have to influence the sharing of data across government and coordinate it?
Well, there are some powers under the Digital Economy Act which do give us some powers to effectively demand data, whether it's from a private business or from other parts of government. But going back to the trust point, generally we've found that we get better quality data and a better working relationship if we can get access to those data sets through conversations, through demonstrating how we can securely store that data and to demonstrate why we need it, than if we launch go through some sort of legal process. Because the reality is that if you're dealing with large, complex data sets and people don't want to provide it, either they will try to stop providing that data set or may provide it in a way which is effectively unusable. So I think trusted relationships between departments and with other data providers has proven much more successful in practice. Now, that does tend to take time to build those trusted relationships, but as I said earlier, we have access to quite a lot of HMRC data, VAT, corporations tax, payroll employees. We're increasingly using that in our official statistics. We have access to a significant number of real-time indicators as well, continuing some of those since the pandemic. Other parts of government are also likewise, I think, have made more progress on data sharing and data linking than where we were a few years ago. So You could say progress has been slower than one would have hoped, and there are still some obstacles. I think that's true. But I wouldn't undersell the progress that's been made in the last 5 years.
So you would hope that in a future emergency, Dr. Loinig wouldn't have to send an email saying to a colleague when in frustration at data sharing.
One would
as he
certainly
told us
hope,
in his
hope
statement.
not. Although I think one area that I think Gemma Tetlow and a couple of other people have mentioned is the restrictions around health data.
Yeah.
That has proved a major barrier, not just to government analysts, but to researchers in this field. Having to get permissions from each individual hospital in order to access patient data, for example, has been a major impediment. And I think the level of restrictions around some of that data have proven excessive and have inhibited research and analysis in this field. We are working with some other departments to kind of try and improve that by establishing a secure space in which that kind of data can be shared securely.
Can I move on then to the fourth topic, which was, data's one thing, analysis. And we heard evidence in the course of these hearings from Rob Harrison, who headed the Directorate General of Analysis in the Cabinet Office, and presumably you're familiar with that as
Yes.
And that became a coordinating analytical function in the Cabinet Office, which was able to provide, as he put it, to create this sort of high trust bubble so that there was one set of analysis to inform, key decisions. How important do you think that sort of model is?
Well, effectively, we're describing a hub and spoke model where you have the coordinating team in the centre, but that wouldn't have worked if you hadn't had statisticians and data scientists and other analysts across government feeding into that.
Yes, quite. Because the way he described it is each department would do its own analysis of data and produce that, and then this would act as a sort of coordinating function, bring that all together and present a snapshot for decision makers. And do you think that was a useful approach?
Absolutely, and I'm not sure how you would manage in terms of informing the government response in terms of the next national pandemic or crisis if you didn't have that coordinating function.
And how would that, I mean, it still exists in a slightly different form, is the evidence we've heard. And does the ONS work with that central body now? And is that helping the ONS in terms of its prioritisation of work and so on?
We do. We have ONS staff in the Joint Data and Analysis Centre, JDAC. We regularly engage with, well, not just the Cabinet Office, but with other departments. And I think the issue, though, and this partly goes back to the RSS point about contingency for the next crisis, is we don't necessarily need 50 or 100 or 200 people sitting around waiting for the next crisis. I think we've demonstrated that we and other departments have the ability to scale up quickly in response to a national crisis. Right. But that does require having people with the right analytical skills in your organisations.
Yeah. So it's about having the skill set and the right skill sets to respond.
Yes, it's not just about the data, it's about the capacity and the collaboration.
Just on the subject of scaling up, I mean, these sound to me, as a lay person, like pretty specialist skill sets. I mean, if you need to scale up, are there lots of data analysts that you can, data scientists that you can just call up at short notice?
Well, there are lots of data analysts out there. Of course, many in the private sector are probably being paid significantly more than in the civil service. But, we do get a lot of people who want to work in government and serve the public good, and also find that the sort of work that you would do, whether it's at the ONS or a policy department, are really interesting and relevant to their careers.
Those are the topics I wanted to cover. I want to give you an opportunity to share any further reflections or observations you might have, really forward-looking in terms of whether there's any other work that you think can or should be done now to put us in a better position to respond in a future emergency.
Well, I think it's always good to take pause from time to time and reflect on whether we are at the level of preparedness and have the level of capacity to respond quickly if we need to. And I'm sure, and there are obvious lessons from what happened in 2020. I mean, my overall assessment is that, and I've talked about some of this before, is that combination of data collaboration, capacity and communication is really essential. So you need some degree of coordination, but you also need people who have the ability to respond in a crisis. I think the ONS made a positive contribution during the pandemic, and obviously we stand ready to respond to if there should be another pandemic or national emergency. But I think the key point about what happened during the pandemic, it was very much a collaborative exercise across government. And we probably are better placed now than we were 5 years ago. As I said, we and other government departments and agencies have access to more high-frequency granular data sets than we did then. We have a lot more data scientists working in government than we did then. And I think all of us will have learned some lessons from 2020 in terms of what worked and what didn't. So I think that has put us in a better place than where we were in March 2020.
Thank you very much. Those are my questions, my lady. I don't think there are any.
There are no other questions. Mr. Fitzer, thank you very much indeed for your help, and I'm sure the help of your colleagues who I'm sure assisted you in preparing for the inquiry's session this afternoon. I found it a bit spooky when you said that you could tell that when there was a 9 o'clock curfew, people were popping down to the corner shop to buy their alcohol to take home, but I'm sure you needed that kind of data to provide decision makers or policy makers with the information they needed. Thank you very much indeed. The points you made about health data, it's something I've heard before in this inquiry, and I've very much got that point on board, although I appreciate it was not the focus of your evidence this afternoon. It's something I'm particularly conscious of. And I'm really grateful to you and your colleagues. Thank you very much for your help.
Thank you very much.
I think that completes the evidence. Mr.
That's my
Wright.
lady. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning to hear the closing submissions of core participants, and the plan is to finish them by lunchtime tomorrow. Thank you.